The 2018 Commonwealth Innovation Forum, brought to you by Destination Gold Coast.
My name is Madonna King. I'm your MC again for the day, and if there's any way I can make you more comfortable, please come and tap me on the shoulder. It's great to welcome some new faces and acknowledge many faces also from yesterday. A quick reminder of a few housekeeping matters. The bathrooms are out the door you entered and to my left. If I could check that your mobile phones are now on silent, and in the unlikely event of an emergency, we would just follow closely the instructions given to us by staff. Thank you also to Virgin Australia, our travel partner, assisting us to travel to Bio, but also bringing our guests here for Innovation Week and Oz Biotech. Remember, we are being streamed around the globe, and many of our questions yesterday came from various parts of the world, and that's via the TCIF website. Yesterday, we pulled innovation apart and we put it back together in a discussion in a bid to define it, the environment in which it flourishes, and those obstacles that sometimes stand in its way. That's all vital, but as we heard late yesterday, so too is communication. That's crucial to its working. And our first session today is on communication across the Commonwealth. And thank you here to our sponsor, James Cook University. This panel will be led by Stefan Wellink from Stefan Wellink and Associates, and a stellar lineup of panellists. You know, disruption is in the headlines daily, whether it be political, economic, social, technical. In that environment, how do we actually teach and communicate the potential of the Commonwealth and its role in the 21st century? Let's find out. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Stefan Wellink.
Thanks very much, Madonna. It's a great pleasure to be here. When I was watching the sessions yesterday, I was really struck by the quality of the people who were here and the issues that we were addressing. And I was particularly interested when I saw the hats being handed out at the very end of the session. And it took me back to about the year 2000 when I was at Bio, and Peter Beattie was there, and he made me an honorary Queenslander. So I already have a hat. I don't need a hat, but I really have very fond memories of those years being in the biotech industry. It's really my pleasure to introduce our panel. And I'd like to introduce firstly Dr. Kate Calcott, Professor Ian Fraser, Dr. Margaret Karembu, Professor Jenny Martin, Dr. John Pickering, Alan Thompson, Professor Ian Wronski. I'd just like to ask a quick question. It'd be good to get a feeling of who's in the audience. Are there any policymakers in the audience? Anyone from government in the audience? From industry? Anyone from industry? Anyone from university, the university sector? Or public sector research?
I'll come back.
Okay, thank you for that.
Get up. All good.
We're going to focus on education, health and gender equality, because the feeling, I think, of all of us is that a well-educated, balanced and healthy nation is fundamental to dealing with global issues such as fluctuating fortunes brought about by climate change, environmental degradation, strategic alliances, cross-cultural collaborations, Brexit, the vagaries of economies, international trade, policy formulation and the pace of change through the transfer and uptake of technology. In other words, I think if you have a healthy, well-educated and well-balanced society, nations are a better place to cope with change. I'd like to throw firstly to Professor Ian Fraser. Ian, have we got it right with education? Do we value teaching and teachers, and if we don't, why don't we?
Well, we certainly value education. We recognise that education is essential to a healthy society. I'm not so sure that we value our teachers enough. Teaching, at least in Queensland, is an occupation largely done by the second income earner in the family, usually a woman, not always. That's largely because find it hard to bring up a family on the salary that teachers get paid. This is a challenge for not just Queensland, it's a challenge worldwide. Education is a social right, but somewhere along the way society has forgotten that it's a social right that has to be bought, and I think we probably underpay those who do the teaching. We also are rather less good at educating our teachers than I think we ought to be. To be a good teacher, you have to be taught, and the education program for teachers requires that you go through a university degree and then special teacher training afterwards. Any other profession, you were doing that, you'd be commanding a salary 2 or 3 times higher than we actually pay our teachers.
Jenny, have you got a view on that? What's your feeling?
On education and the importance of education, obviously it's critical, and I guess I'd like to go back a step and say that the World Economic Forum and the McKinsey report recently came out to say that if we address issues of not just education but equal health, education, economic and political participation of women in the world, we will generate an increased economy of $28 trillion. $28 trillion, what does that look like? That's more than the total GDP of China and the US, number 1 and number 2, or could be the other way around now, GDPs in the world. And yet we don't do that. We don't have gender parity in any of the education, health, economy and politics. In Australia and in most of the Commonwealth, we're not doing too badly in training as many women as men, but we're actually losing women once they enter that workforce, and we're not providing the right societal support for women to proceed and to contribute. And I'd also like to mention that we're moving away from capitalism towards the ability to have people, the talentism, if you like, and yet we're losing half of our best talent by not supporting them properly. So that's my comment.
And is it a failure of the policy framework, or is it a combination of things that is causing this?
It's a very complex problem. The gender equity is what's called a wicked problem, where there are multifactorial contributions to the lack of women entering and progressing and being retained in systems. Part of it is policy, part of it is societal, our own expectations, and even within STEM, where particular aspects of STEM, life sciences, for example, where we've been training more women than men in undergraduate levels for about 30 years in this country and other countries. We still, when we look at the leadership levels in those areas, we have less than 20% women. So there's something wrong with the systems and the structures that were set up hundreds of years ago by men for men with stay-at-home wives. And that's no longer fit for purpose for men or women. So we need to change, we need to recognise that we hold biases individually and as a community, and that we need to step back and look at the way that we've set up systems and change them to be better for everyone.
Margaret.
Thank you. Now, when you look at the Commonwealth and the amount of investment that has been made to education, is definitely encouraging. And where I see it in Africa, looking at our universities, our young people, the difference between enrollment, boys and girls, male and female, it's almost looking like it's at par now, almost 50%. But of course, given that girls are also getting an advantage in maybe getting 1 or 2 points lower to go to the university, has encouraged more young people to get into the sciences. And so basically, I think there's a lot of hope in bridging that gap between boys and girls, but I think the policy environment is still not as conducive, especially in opening up space for young graduates who are now coming out of our universities. We have a mass of skilled people, but if the policy is not encouraging investment in the biosciences, bioenterprises, then you end up losing out on those skills by getting scientists going into the banking sector. It's not bad, but we definitely need those skills in the bioenterprises so that we can build our health, our agriculture, our environmental systems based on that knowledge that we're investing. So there's still a lot that needs to be done at the policy. The other level that needs to be addressed is the level of the regulatory. I think the regulatory systems, especially in the life sciences, is more biased to more of industrial, bigger corporations than the smaller enterprises. And so we need to also bring up that policy misunderstanding that there's need to grow our local industries, our local enterprises. And we do that by having enabling regulatory environment that allows them to thrive. Otherwise, if we keep on making them too stiff, they're too expensive and too cumbersome, we still don't give room for them to grow. So we again perpetuate what we'd call a multi kind of oppression, where only the big ones are able to thrive, especially in Africa.
Thank you. Ian Wronski, do you have a view on education, where it sits, what might need to be done to improve things, what might be done to help employers identify, attract and retain the best and brightest that they can afford?
So I come with that, with a health system perspective, and I sort of work at the interface of the health and education systems. I think it's quite an interesting, practical policy example of how Commonwealth nations can learn from each other. There's a global tide moving towards universal health access. Notions endorsed by the UN, WHO. A number of the Commonwealth countries have experimented with the education of the health workforce and its implications. There are very strong examples in some of the Commonwealth countries, and the education systems that are required to produce a workforce that can manage and contemplate the future developments. I think however, on the policy side of health workforce education and educating people to participate in the health system, I think the Commonwealth countries haven't taken enough advantage of working together, reducing the barriers to the mobility of the educated health professionals. It's still quite difficult, even in countries with similar GDP, for health personnel to move without total free movement, relatively freely between economies, even though the training standards and education standards are similar. And so I think that there's a lot of benefit that could be gained from the Commonwealth countries who really share some underpinning understandings about how civil society works that could motivate significant developments around both health systems and the education systems that provide the health workforce.
How might we work to encourage people to move across cultures and work in other countries in a seamless fashion? What are the incentives? What incentives should be given to them to do that, so the interaction can be more meaningful and deeper? Because that seems to me to be an issue, and to me to be an obvious way of doing things, particularly if we're talking about the importance of collaboration, which is what we've been talking about the last 2 days. How do we make those things meaningful in a sustainable way, do you think?
I think there's a couple of big issues. One is exposing students coming through our systems to more multicultural perspectives on how societies and how health systems work and how education systems work. But there's also really a regulatory side The reality is that there are very significant barriers that, that do need to be overcome if we're going to take advantage of the movement of health personnel and other professionals across economies. And so I think they're quite big jobs, and it's both at the local level and at the multilateral level.
Thank you very much. John, have you got any views on this? How do you feel, and what's going through your mind?
Sure. Look, I think as a behavioural scientist, we tend to think of problems like this in terms of education as how the system is behaving, for want of a better term. And what I've certainly heard from the other panellists is this need for this sort of connected approach across policy settings, across the institutions, be it the curricula, training, be it of research students or undergraduates or school students, and so on and so forth. So at all parts of that system, there's reinforcers, I suppose, of behaviour that are important to diagnose, for want of a better term, for this to work. And I think that's probably the most important thing that I think about, is adopting that systems approach. And I think about questions to do with employability and ensuring that we have our education system geared as such that we have students that are graduating at various different tiers of the education system that are highly employable is one of the biggest challenges if you think about the incoming needs in terms of workforces into the future. And I think that is a question that certainly needs to be attended to. So it's that behavioural approach to the system, I think, Stefan, that is important, and how we're thinking about what are the actual skills that we're training people in as we think about the economies of the future.
I think it'd be nice now if you could share with us the story about the behavioural contract, one of the issues that you introduced recently in a major project you're doing. The project's called Project Cane Changer. Could you describe to us what you're doing in that project and what the behavioural contract was meant to achieve?
Sure. So the issue here is to do with the Great Barrier Reef and the pollutants that are running out to the reef, in particular from agricultural practices such as cane farms, and the way that the farmers, of course, fertilise crops, and there's nitrogen and so forth in those crops, and it invariably can run out onto the reef and cause some problems. And the challenge here was to go, okay, this has been known for a while, how do we create a situation where we can really accelerate the adoption of best management practices, because the farmers not necessarily getting on board with that as quickly as they would like. And so we hatched this project about how we design a behavioural change program which, among other things, gets the growers to commit to change, but it understands it in the context of that often when we think about change, we think about it's that group over there that needs to do something differently. And what we actually found is that it's other groups, like the way the scientific and policy community was referring to the farmers, that was actually causing a bit of the issue. And insofar as that the farmers were feeling vilified and they were feeling persecuted by this implication that they had with the Great Barrier Reef and their farming practices. And they felt like they were being treated as for want of a better term, Stefan, Neanderthals who were reluctant to change and to get on board with these new programs. And they felt that the government, in particular, was promulgating that opinion. And so we went out and we spoke to the farmers and we said, so what's going on, guys? There's a lot being said about you here, about needing to change, and you're not changing, and why not? We've got a major crisis on our hands here with the Great Barrier Reef here in Queensland, and we need to do something about it. And they'd say to us, John, we don't understand this. We are stewards of the land. We love the environment. In fact, we've been changing every day of our lives. And if we hadn't, we'd be out of business. And it became really clear to us that there was this big imbalance between what the individuals, the group that we wanted to see change, were thinking about themselves and what they perceived the world to be thinking of them. And so rather than focus on the farmers, Stefan, for change, we flipped it around and we said, okay, how about we look at what the government can do differently to alleviate this negative, vilifying context that they're operating in. And one of the things we did is we asked the minister at the time, this was last year, Minister Stephen Miles, the Environment Minister here in Queensland, then Environment Minister, to sign a behaviour contract, which was actually to modify his behaviour and the government's behaviour about how the government refers to, talks to and positively recognises the efforts of cane farmers to actually do something differently rather than looking to legislate or to do something that's more punitive. And I was very pleased to see that that process has continued with Minister Enoch, who took over late last year when we had the election and the shuffle of the ministry, who went to a cane farm in her second week of office to sign a cane changer commitment, which is a behaviour contract, as I was mentioning, about this government and her particular ministry's response to being positive to the cane farmers. And to give you some idea, we've seen in places like Tully in the far north of Queensland, over 500% increase in the adoption of what you call best management farming practices in that particular district. And that's due to a number of things, Stefan, but it is definitely also due to the fact that we have a behaviour contract or an approach to change that doesn't just target the end group that we think that needs to change, but something higher up in the system. And I think that approach is certainly transferable and applicable to many domains.
So you're saying that the ministers knew what they were signing? They signed it. Is that true?
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. Yes.
I think that's a great story. You know, would you be advocating that we should try and get these types of commitments made by other parts of the economy, sectors in the economy, people to actually sign on and say, I am committed? It really is a commitment agreement, isn't it, to force through whatever the changes that are meant to be made?
It is, Stefan, and it's one of those interesting things where, you know, if you think about the lay of the land, there was a general sense out there when you think about it, that people were saying the farmers, they're old, they won't change. There were these beliefs about people and the extent to which they're not likely to do anything different because that's just who they are. If you speak to farmers or other people, they'll say in the reverse, government, that's just the way government is and they won't do this and they'll be cynical and so on and so forth. Whereas the reality, of course, there are political realities that I'm not naive to, but at the end of the day, our experience has been that you're never too old or too anything to change or to learn, and under the right conditions, change is definitely possible. Either it depends it doesn't matter if you're a minister or whether you're a farmer on the ground. And so I think adopting that approach and believing that things can be different is really important, because otherwise we can get stuck in these cycles of cynicism and negativity which aren't good for anybody.
Which then really speaks to trust.
It does.
And how we trust each other and the system. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
One of your roles is as an enabler in the work that you do. Can you describe what that means and how that affects the work that you do?
Tēnā koutou. I'm the Science and Innovation Officer for the British High Commission in Wellington. So really what that means is I connect people in the UK with those in New Zealand that want to work together. So I see my role as a facilitator or enabler, which actually helps get those conversations going. And we've had a bit of change recently, which many people are aware of. Some call it Brexit. And what that means for us is the UK government is looking at how we relate to our key partners. That's globally and that's in the Commonwealth. And this month is a really important month for us to be having those right conversations, strategic conversations. How do we make change happen globally? And so I'm this point that helps connect up those two nations and work with my colleagues globally to elicit change.
What are the issues that are stopping you from achieving the things that you want to achieve?
Well, I guess it comes back to how people communicate about science, and I really enjoyed Margaret's talk yesterday, which touched upon a lot of the issues that we face in terms of international communication. And knowledge transfer is mostly done efficiently face-to-face, which is why scientists love conferences and events like this. But how do you do that when we're so spread? And it's that age-old question of how do you get people to talk together when they don't actually know each other. And in the Commonwealth, we have a variety of countries that have a shared background, yes, shared values, shared laws, but also a cultural diversity and different ways that we communicate. So in addition to a geographical barrier, there's also social barriers. And so I'm really interested to be here today to kind of absorb what people might see as mechanisms to overcome both of those and work closer together.
The area of policy development, policy advice, you do partake in that yourself.
Yes, yeah.
How easy is it to convince policymakers to change direction, and have you ever had to do that? No one's listening, only the whole world apparently, but you can speak freely.
So my role largely sits in this, what they call the nexus between science and policy, and it is quite a murky grey space. How do you get policy analysts to talk to scientists at the right time, and how do you get scientists to actually understand how policy is created? And so I'm involved in this group that Sir Peter Gluckman, who's the Chief Science Advisor for the New Zealand government, he's set up to help train both policy analysts and scientists on communicating across that gap. And I haven't personally elicit change, but I'm learning about what the challenges are, and one of those sticky areas is impact. And science impact, and how do you measure science impact and communicate impact, and what that really means for the people who are funding the research, which is largely the public. And so there's a lot of issues that are wrapped up in that, but actually just getting that conversation going, how to not just sticking with status quo, but actually improving the way we engage with the right parties at the right times.
On that point about communicating with the public, Ian, if I can just turn to you, when Gardasil was developed and when it was sort of put out into the public, how effective was that communication with the public in your view?
Look, it's varied very much from country to country, and it depends on the message that was being sent out at the time. In Australia, it was a very successful launch of a new public health measure because it had a high public profile in a context outside of health. Look, I was Australian of the Year in 2006 at the time when the vaccine was launched, and that was a very public event. And I think that the world got the message, at least within Australia, about how important this vaccine might be in the future. If you go to other countries and look what's happened, quite a lot of the time we started talking about it as a vaccine to prevent a sexually transmitted disease, which was not the right message. We now recognise that was a mistake. But at the time there was an education process had to be gone through because the general public didn't know anything about cancer as a transmissible disease. And so the message was, well, there's a virus causes this, and then how do you get the virus through sexual intercourse? That was the wrong message. We should have said this is a vaccine to prevent or reduce your risk of getting cancer. That's a much more acceptable message. And you learn by your mistakes, but it's taken 20 years to reverse that mistake because we were wrong at the beginning. So I think that the message is that we have to be more careful about working out whether we're getting the message right before we get the message out there, rather than doing it after the event.
Yes, it's too late at that point. Ian, what about you? Should we be training scientists, engineers, in things like public speaking, in things like basic communicating, in things like how to appear on TV and be eloquent and articulate and compelling? Is that something that we should build into the curriculum at universities or even at schools?
I think certainly at schools. Having lived in a couple of different places, it's surprising how some school systems, less so in Australia, but emphasise the capacity to deliver a message, and it's judged. And certainly the Australian system, we could do a lot more of that in the school system. Once people are getting to universities and they're graduates and they're already in industry or playing a policy role, I don't know about routinely applying it to everyone, but we certainly need a lot more people who are able to shape a message so that the grab occurs and it's delivered in a way that a broader audience than their own colleagues can actually understand. Whether it's something, my guess is, look, some of these things already exist. I don't think it's routinely in people's curriculum as public speaking. In some I guess in some schools it already is. In Australia, I think it's underemphasised, though I think in the US, actually a lot more effort is put into the role of public speaking and how you have an impact in media and in a society and in a policy framework. And we could learn something from that, I think.
Stephen, may I
Yes,
comment?
yes,
as
of
well?
course.
Sorry.
Please. Yes.
Look, I think there's a huge opportunity for scientists to engage with the community through science communication, which is not just about public speaking. Absolutely, that's part of it. But with the digital revolution, we have a whole new media, social media, that young people use every day. And we should be encouraging people to use that media to get the message across about science and about how science can help society. But we should also be valuing that communication between scientists and the community and government and other stakeholders, and we don't do that at the moment. At the moment, we focus on things like H-index or number of papers published or where you are on the paper that really mean nothing to the community at all. Why don't we measure and value the communication that we have with the community as well and make that a marker of success too for scientists?
It's interesting you talk about H-index and those metrics. I remember it was only very recently that things like patents became sort of counted
Yes.
towards whether or not you were promoted in the university
totally
system.
pushed to the side.
And now you're talking about much softer things, equally important.
Well, another one is mentoring. And the reason
Yep.
I talk about science communication and mentoring as things that we should value and measure and reward is because women tend to do those things better than men, but they're not valued. And perhaps we could change the way that the community and the sector values women by valuing those things that women do more often.
So we're talking about some major behavioural changes here.
And
that
some
are
policy
required.
changes.
And some policy change. Well, one will lead to the other, I think.
Yes, yeah.
I'll come to you in a moment, Alan. You're on my mind, and I'll be coming to you in a moment. He's being very patient and enjoying himself. And,
I'm here for the aesthetics. Appreciating this.
In fact, I'll come to you now. There's a metric, I think, at the moment that the Commonwealth of Nations, there are 60% of people are under the age of 30. You're working on a project, the NEAT project, which is right in that slot. Can you explain to us what that is and why it's meaningful?
Yeah, before I do, I think I'd just like to say I couldn't agree more about the digital communication that you mentioned there that we need to get into our schools. I work in the education sector, primarily in the UK, and we work from the age of 5 to 18 primarily, and looking at how technology and innovative technologies can enrich and enhance teaching and learning across all subject areas, not just science. And we look at those skills and we look at the teacher training that was mentioned today, because it's all very well coming along and saying, you know, we all hear all the time, don't we, that the children of today, we're training them for jobs that haven't been invented yet and so on and so forth. But we have to get the teachers we have to upskill those teachers and recognise the importance of that. And that's something I do a lot, and my company does a lot. We work with education departments, we work with governments, we work with clusters and academies to try and get the use of innovative technologies across the curriculum, and those soft skills that we've talked about, and that certainly the social media is a key part of that. Just coming to the fact that we have so many under 30-year-olds in the Commonwealth, it's relevant to something that's going on in the UK at the moment. There's been a lot of research into 16 to 24-year-olds. So pretty much when I finish with them, what happens then? So 16 to 24, we have something we call NEAT, which is not in employment, education or training. And in the UK at the moment, we have just shy of 800,000 16 to 24-year-olds who are NEAT, not in employment, education or training. And programmes have been put into place, the Career and Enterprise Programme, which I'm very involved with my company, to support what happens before they hit 16. And by engaging with employers, and we hear all the time, I certainly hear all the time at forums and events like this, you know, we're industry leaders saying, oh, there's the skills gap and the students are coming to us, they're not skilled in the things that we need them to be skilled in and so on and so forth. So it's about getting the employers, getting the industry leaders to get involved with the students before they hit 16. And the research has shown that if we engage employers, if we put students into a workplace beyond work experience, I mean, I'm not talking about going for a week and doing some work experience, I'm talking about really engaging where your staff are supporting them as mentors, where you spend time with the school leaders to really look at the careers programs in the schools and so on. If you can get that support from the workplace before they're 16, we can reduce that NEET figure by 86%. That's a massive number. If we can get that 800,000 down by 86%, we can reduce the chance of somebody becoming NEET by 86%. And we can also look at increasing their starting salary by 18%. Now in the UK, obviously we're very focused on those figures. We're doing a lot about that. But if you think that 60% of the Commonwealth is under the age of 30, then that's the right age group again to really be focusing on. And it's what are we doing, what can we do from an education perspective to engage with those industry leaders, to engage with the workplaces. It's a very simple project that we have. I mean, basically it's filtered so you have somebody, an enterprise leader who is paid, that's their job, to work with 20 schools and 20 businesses to put a business into each of those schools, and the businesses do it for free. I give 5 of my staff to be mentors. They've had mentor training which was given to them, and now they have groups of these potential NEET under 16-year-olds that they work with. I go in and work at a higher level with the school leaders. So we look at the careers programs in the school. We have the students come into our workplace and actually see a workplace. They come, and it's not, as I say, work experience where they come for the week. It's ongoing so that these students fully understand what it means to be in employment. And we are seeing a huge difference already. So I think that's an exciting opportunity. We've seen the results, as I say, in the UK. We're at the start of it now, but we are seeing results. And I think it'd be really exciting if we could look to do something. We certainly work in our other work that we do with the technology and the curriculum across the Commonwealth. We've just done a big project in Malta, working with education ministers there and advisors to work across all the schools in Malta and Gozo. So there is a very easy link that we can make in the Commonwealth, especially embracing and harnessing those digital links that we can make and that the students are so familiar with.
And I mean, it's a great example of successful translation of technology, innovation, persistence, I guess, to hang in there. You've touched the lives of, I think, is it 25,000 students now in the time?
Last year alone, last academic year alone, we worked with 25,000 students across the UK. And then in the UK, it's quite easy for us to being so small, especially compared to Australia. I saw a postcard the other day where the whole of Europe was fitted into Australia, and there was still space left over. It really is such a big country. But it's quite easy for us to get into the schools and work with decision makers and policy leaders in local authorities and local government. So yes, we have worked, as I say, last year alone with 25,000 children. That's harder to do in Malta or Australia, where it is about getting to the staff and getting to the children. So we are using a train-the-trainer approach now, where we, as I say, in Malta we worked with 25 advisors in the education department and helped them to take that message about the use of technology in the curriculum, and then they go into their schools and they disseminate that as a train-the-trainer approach. And today I have a meeting at the Education Office at 10:30 today, and hopefully we'll be looking at doing something similar in Queensland if there's a hunger for it.
Is the sort of thing you're talking about, is that a franchisable thing? Have you thought about trying to roll that out, make it specific for various countries? And
so I started teaching at 21. I was a teacher for 10 years. I was a primary school teacher with no business experience at all. So we've got 34 staff now. We've certainly grown. But I've only ever seen it from my perspective and what I've grown as what I wanted my vision to be, and I don't really know how I can get somebody else to have come on the journey that I've come on, where I've had 30 children in my class and seen the difference there, and then thought, actually I could do this with lots of teachers and get them to do it with their kids. And now you're talking 25,000 a year kind of thing. And I don't know if you could franchise that journey, I suppose. But I'm not ruling it out. I don't like the jet lag, to be honest with you. So if there's anybody here who wants to do my job,
you can telecommute, you know, you can. Yeah. But I think from what I'm hearing you say, and I think it's a great story, is that, you know, you're able to change your part of the world. And I guess where I'm going with the discussion is that if you could find like-minded individuals in other parts of the Commonwealth, let's say, to do similar things and get that critical mass, you know, if they each had 25,000 students,
I don't think that needs to be a business model, though. I just think we need to talk to the right people in education. I think we need to talk to policymakers, decision makers. We need to go to the education offices and sit down and say, look, this is what we can do. I mean, when I went to Malta and met the education department there, told them what we've been doing for the last 10 years, as it was then in the UK, the education minister there started going like this. And I thought he was cold, and I'm sweating in a suit in Malta. And he starts rubbing his arms and he said, you're giving me goosebumps, he said, because you're doing things in the UK that we only dreamt was possible here in Malta. Now, if you can have that impact on him, you don't need a business model, you don't need a franchise, you don't need someone with an office. You need to talk to him and say, it's doable, this is how we're going to do it.
He's your champion.
Exactly, yeah.
Exactly.
If your champion is somebody who's coming at it from an education department approach rather than a business model, I think that's far more powerful. And that was my journey. It came from being a teacher in the classroom. And I think if we can look at that in education departments and clusters and academies and local government, that's far more powerful.
Thank you for that. That's really wonderful. Margaret, would that sort of approach work in Kenya? Could you see that being a value for you?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of value. And I was just thinking, in terms of getting our policymakers to appreciate science, much as the social media has become such a key component of that, we also need to think about how we can change the curriculum of the mass media, schools of journalism, and how we are training our journalists, because there's a big gap in that specialized writing is not really seen as a sellable product. And yet, most of our policymakers' first connection with science is through the mass media. So we need to also look at the curriculum of the schools of journalism. And one aspect that works very well with us in regard to what my panelist has just said, we have a kind of a pairing program where you pair scientists with policymakers, and so you work together. We have also found that you can pair journalists with scientists, especially those that have been trained in agricultural reporting, and that is also causing quite some good impact. And by that, then you are able to get the right message to the policymaker so that you can also address what is in it for him. Because the policymaker, of course, every day you go to the office, you're looking at some immediate decisions that you can make that can either, make you more popular, retain your seat. And so we really need to make science a sellable product where the policymaker feels he or she is not at risk by supporting a life science innovation, for example, because there is the political part and then there is the developmental part. Now, when it comes to the holistic science communication, doing mentorship and peer-to-peer kind of review is very important for policymakers. I know I've participated in taking a number of politicians to the European Union Parliament just to help in clarifying a lot of myths and misconceptions about what value science, technology, and innovation would have, especially in the agricultural sector. I don't prescribe to the subsistence, to the agroecology. I know they are all very important, but that is what we have all done in Africa. And so there is some miscommunication about the value of innovation in the agricultural sector and the thinking that backwards is better than moving forward. And so for the Commonwealth, we really need to have a concerted effort to make sure that science matters. We have an opportunity to improve on our science communication. We have an opportunity with the young people and the social media. We need to be careful, though, on the type of refereeing that is done through the social media, because, again, you can end up doing a lot of miscommunication through the social media. And I guess for many scientists and researchers like us, you get a bit skeptical getting into that space because you're not sure whether your messages will be misinterpreted or misused. But definitely, it's a big virtual space that we all need to be. And we don't need to be very scared. What we need is just to have the courage, get the right messaging, get the right tactics, and our policymakers will definitely, finally, get to appreciate what is being done in the lab.
You have a Minister of Science in your country?
Now, that's also another challenge within the Commonwealth. It's not uniform.
Yes.
In my country, Kenya, we have a Ministry of Education, General, and that is where science and technology lies. We used to have a Ministry of Science and Technology, but now we don't have it. So you'll always find the education part, the tertiary, the primary, takes the bigger pool of resources. Then again, science, technology, innovation is at the periphery. So within the Commonwealth, maybe that is also another thing that we could recommend, that we need to have distinct ministries of science, technology, and innovation so that we can give science its space in society.
And I agree with you. I think everybody in the room would agree with you. But and one of the other issues is that, and we've suffered from this in Australia, is that from time to time the Minister for Science hasn't been in Cabinet. They've been outside of Cabinet. So when the big decisions are taken, science doesn't have a say. So when there are budget cuts, they just cut. No one there to argue in the opposite direction or put another point of view. And I think that every one of the nations in the Commonwealth, if they don't have a science minister, need to have one. And they should be getting together on a regular basis, I think that's where a lot of the policy issues can be discussed. That's where a lot of the big issues can be discussed, taking on board, the advice that people like the Ians are giving, and Jenny, all the people here are giving from time to time, and saying, this is what's happening in our country, what's happening in yours. Are there areas of commonality where we can get together and then make projects happen? If it doesn't happen at the government level, I don't think it's going to happen. And I think that's a big issue. And that's why I was asking before, are there any policy makers in the audience, and why has nobody put their hand up? Because it's... Hello? Well, do you have a view? Have you got a view on this?
On what specifically?
Well, policy and science and making decisions and changing the way we do things and how we do it. Could you state your name, please, and your affiliation? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Brian Mitchell. I'm the member for Lions in Tasmania, but I'm also a member of the House of Representatives Innovation, Industry, Science and Resources Committee, and I'm here on their behalf today, mainly as an observer, and I'll report back to the committee when we meet back in Canberra in May. So thank you. It's been a very interesting discussion. I've got a couple of questions and observations I've made so far. I come from a media background, so one of the concerns, my antennae started going up when you were all talking about the importance of communications education for scientists, which I think is a laudable goal. It's laudable for anybody to seek to be more educated in how to communicate. But I think for me as a policymaker, when I talk to scientists, what I want is the best scientist in the room and not necessarily the best communicator. So one of the concerns I've got is if young people who are interested in going into science, if it's part of the formal curriculum that they have to also be good communicators, I think you may potentially see some kids who could be very good scientists, perhaps not going into that field because they're not very confident about projecting themselves publicly. So what I'd like to see is more of what Margaret touched on, which is more collaboration between scientists and journalists. I think that's a great idea, is to partner experts in science with experts in communication, and that I think is a much, perhaps a better way to get the message across. And coming on Ian's mea culpa about the promotion of Gardasil, perhaps if they'd gone to really good public relations firm or a marketing firm before they put the product out and said, hey, we want to market this product. I think any good PR person would have said, don't market it as a sexually transmitted disease medicine, market it as a cancer medicine. So I think that goes to that point. The other issue is that earlier on in the discussion, you were talking about the importance of transportability of expertise, which I think everybody here would agree on. It's so vital. But at the macro level, and Kate touched on this with Brexit, what we're seeing across Europe in particular, and the US, is a hardening of borders at the macrocultural and geopolitical level. The nation states are closing in on each other. They're narrowing their focus. And while we've still got international portability of capital, and perhaps to some degree experts in certain fields, it's become quite a transactional relationship. We don't have the same sort of cultural support for internationalism that we once had. And I wonder whether that's impacting on the innovation that we're trying to achieve.
Well, thank you for those. Anyone else got a... Oh, yeah, please, go ahead. Please.
Okay.
Yeah,
So with Brexit, I'm not in the political side, so I really can't comment on that. So there might be a change in how the UK relates to Europe, but in terms of how science and innovation in the UK is relating to the world, it's actually quite a positive story because we are looking at how we integrate and how we open things up, how we increase movement of experts, that it's not limited by these borders that might be created by certain countries. It's all about how do we facilitate that inter-country working. And the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth Forum, which is happening in a couple of weeks' time, is a really key mechanism that the UK is looking to use. And it's all about how you bring together the right people. And the challenges that we're facing, and was talked about a lot yesterday, is that these are multidisciplinary. And not every country has all of the solutions within itself. And for example, climate change, you have people that are looking at the oceans, people that are looking at atmosphere. How do you get these people with different disciplines to be able to talk to each other? And one way that they do it within the UK and within New Zealand within the nation is that there's centres for innovation or centres for excellence. So that's not actually bound geographically. It's more like an umbrella organisation that brings together people to talk to each other about particular matters. What I'm interested in is, could we do that across the Commonwealth? Could there be Commonwealth Centres for Excellence where we might actually be able to set up platforms that aren't sitting within one particular country that is actually aiding that sort of discussion? Just putting it out there.
Anybody else in the audience want to make any comment about what you've heard so far? Any questions, any observations? Anybody else on the panel? Oh, someone else here? Oh yeah, please, in the front row. Is that you, Peter?
Hello, I'm behind the flower.
I can see you hiding there, yeah. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Peter Riddles. Kate, thanks for your comments. I know in the UK, the Royal Society have a partnering program between scientists and policymakers, and I thought that might be a useful model maybe for other members of the Commonwealth to adopt. And I know Dr. Hakim Yard is in the audience. Do you know about that program? Maybe?
Yes, I am aware. And so it is. It's kind of like run as an internship. So people are put from science and policy. They have a time spent in the other camp, and it's actually facilitated understanding of both processes, which comes back to what they're doing in New Zealand as well, that I'm part of that initiative, and I'm aware they're doing that in Canada, and they've got a science policy exchange group set up there. I'm not quite aware of other countries picking up this initiative, but it's actually really excellent because it's approaching these issues that aren't just science-based, they're social-based, they're policy-based, and so you're getting people to think about the different languages that a scientist should actually be thinking about. So it's how do you communicate with the public? It's how do you use the media? How do you use social media? It's that whole nexus. It's actually a great space to be in.
So here's an example of a very articulate scientist. You know, they're out there, you know, they are out there. Jenny, have you got any comments on this?
Yes, I have a comment. I wanted to pick up on the point the member for Lyons made about unanticipated consequences of putting in place policies that might prevent the progression of great scientists. The problem is we already have that problem. We lose half of our best talent because the systems and structures that we have in place do not support the progression of women. So this is already recognised by universities and science and technology organisations around the world. The UK has led the world in addressing this problem by implementing the Athena Swan Charter, which allows organisations to sign up to a charter that values the contribution of women, recognises that there are barriers to their progression, allows them to set up a business plan that requires collecting data on the problems and then implementing that business plan to show progress. And you can win awards. You can win a bronze, a silver or gold, depending on how well you do. So that's been really fabulous in the UK, and we're currently in the middle of a pilot in Australia of the Athena Swan Charter here. Canada has just announced that they will also introduce a pilot of the Athena Swan Charter to address the progression of women in science, technology, engineering, maths and medicine. One thing the Commonwealth could do is actually have all Commonwealth countries subscribe to the Athena Swan Charter and recognise the value that women have in science, technology, engineering, maths and medicine, and address the problems that lead to the leakage of half of our best talent.
Yes, oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That's great. I've got a question about communication across the generations. 50 years ago, or 40-something years ago, Australia elected a really reformist government, the Whitlam government, and the most junior portfolio in the First Ministry was science. In fact, it only just pipped out health for last. The millennials are going to run the world if they're not already doing it. What are the lessons we need to learn about changing from the way the baby boomers were communicated with about the value of science and what the millennials will demand?
Should we answer by age, or how should we answer this question? Ian Wronski, have you got a view on that? I'm sure you have.
Well, I've got kids, and I guess in a university we're surrounded with students all the time, and it's a huge it's a very precipitated change brought about by digitisation, really, and the way my kids and the young kids we're having into universities communicate with each other, and that's resulting in a revolution, whether we like it or not, in education, in the way science is done, in the way communication occurs. It creates mismatches between networking between individuals and a physical knowledge of geography. So, I mean, my daughter's an interesting example. Not silly. Amazing international networks of contacts, but couldn't point to them on a globe. And I see that commonly as the world contracts. I think certainly within most of the institutions I know about at a practical level, there's just been dramatic changes in how the university environment, for a start, operates. You know, people don't come to lectures, and our example, we invite people in with their own devices, and much of the lecture material is via the device with interaction, and the students are talking to each other all the time, and we've done that as a trial, and to test to what degree information can be transmitted through a sort of a much more interactive environment. Universities are having their business models significantly challenged by the online environment, but also by the pressure of work experience, where increasing numbers of students already have work, and digitisation has made their access to the education system much more available and much more palpable. And so I think in all the universities I know, we're all having to, and change will continue. So we're having to find models for the education environment, and in the innovation, for the co-creation realms in the innovation environment. And I think it's not just a generational issue. It's partly a generational issue. It's also making sure that the impact of digitisation doesn't create greater barriers in society than already exist. So I think that's a bigger issue. So, for instance, personally I've been involved around Indigenous populations a lot for 40 years and rural remote populations a lot, and have seen the mixed benefits of the communications revolution and digitisation and technology. And I think a really important issue for us is making sure that we don't make some of the social determinants of health worse, because we're not factoring in access to modern technology at the societal level. And universities can do a bit. And look, we all measure our own, lower socioeconomic status percentages of students, and there are hurdles around that. But across even the wealthier of the Commonwealth societies, the digital gap, I think, is actually widening. And I think across many of the world's economies, I think the digital gap is widening. And something that the Commonwealth could assist with at a policy level was thinking about how, as a group, we might learn from each other's economies and institutions, and how we might implement effective policy measures that would reduce the risk of the digitisation revolution making the gaps that result in the social determinants of health worse.
Oh, thank you for that. As a behavioural scientist, what are you observing? What changes are you seeing? This is a big picture question.
Sure.
So you got 5 minutes. It's okay.
Look, the comment I think I'd make about the generational issue is that it is clearly a big one, and the main point that I'd make is that I think it's essential that we all work together on this. And I come at that from, I'm 34, so I'm right at the cusp, that millennial X generation. I see myself as a millennial, and our team, about a dozen of us, are all millennials. But one of the things that we did, the first thing we did was we'll put on a board of boomers, you might call it, of older, experienced, extremely wise heads that would help guide us through a number of different things that we really felt we wouldn't have the answers to, and just because there are certain things that come with time. that you can't possibly replace or replicate.
It's called wisdom.
Wisdom, indeed, among many other things. And so the issue that we can sometimes inadvertently find ourselves in, and the behavioural side to this, is this sort of intergroup scenario where we have the boomers, group A over here, and the millennials and group B over here, and there are these sort of different interests. And I think that could represent a bit of a problem, and so that united approach to whatever the issue, be it communication or anything, is important. And how I would define that is by not being too presumptuous about each other group's preferences, interests, wants, capabilities, weaknesses, strengths, etc. And as one example of that, there's a lot made of gender equity, rightfully, in today's age. And just so happens our team, by the way, about 60% female, and 80% of our workforce, full-time workforce, is female as opposed to males. And on average, females earn more than males in our company, just to clarify where we're coming from. But in setting up a board, I asked the female workforce within our organisation, should we put a quota on having females, for example, represented in a certain way, or males on the board? And unanimously they all said, no, we don't want that. That's not something that we're interested in. And you see some developments in policy and so forth head down that path, but when at least in our sort of single case study with our organisation of a very, very bright group of millennial women, we're not interested in something like that. And I just use that as an example of to not be presumptuous of each other's generational sort of traits, tendencies and characteristics, I think is what I'd say, Stefan.
That's a great point. It's a complex issue. I mean, it's not a small one. Jenny, any comment on this, or Margaret, or?
Yeah, we definitely see the social media and the millennia as a big opportunity to communicate science. However, we also see it as a challenge, because sometimes there is it's like an endless, how long and how far can you engage? But looking at the young people, they are such a big pool of resource that we can use to communicate science, and the energy they have and the enthusiasm to really share that knowledge. The fact that now within the Commonwealth, a message can come from Kenya, and within a few seconds it's already in Australia, in the US and all that. It's really a big opportunity. We also need to put in those mentorship programs for the young people, because I tend to feel that within the science realm, you can also end up having a big young population that is a bit shallow in the way they look at things, because a message is sent and that message is followed, but the depth of it could be lacking. So there's still a big space for our universities, our professors, to really mentor the young people to contain part of that energy so that they can go to some depth. When it comes to women, I also see a big opportunity there for women to influence policy at different levels. And within the Commonwealth, I'm not sure if many of the countries have these parliamentary committees, and we are using those parliamentary committees a lot. If the politicians cannot come to us, because when you invite them for meetings, they will not come. So what we do, we ask them to provide us that opportunity when they have the committee meetings, and those have become very useful. In Kenya, in Uganda, I know they're doing that, in Nigeria, in Ghana, and really, these are opportunities that we can all use and we can advance to help in getting our policymakers appreciate what the young people are doing, and then linking that with the farmers. And one more thing about the cellular phone. It has also become very important, because the farming communities in the developing countries in the Commonwealth have used that a lot. There are many apps now that you can use to reach to the farming community at whatever remote place you are in. So there's no excuse now for not accessing science messages or health, environment messages. So the opportunities are big, and we could utilize those.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
We have to wrap up in a minute, but please, Jenny.
Just one comment. So a few years ago, I had the privilege to participate in the London Business School Senior Executive Program, and I learned a lot. Coming from a science background, this was completely new stuff for me. But I think one of the biggest lessons I learned was we're in the middle of a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, and the solution is also VUCA, vision, understanding, clarity and agility. So that's part of the innovation process. But the second thing I learned was that we need to flip around the mentor-mentee relationship, and we need to make sure that baby boomers like me have mentors that are young and are digitally literate and can teach me about the social media and techniques that I need to use. So I now have a Chief Disruption Officer who's young.
I do that all the time
Yes.
in the office. I have young mentors who mentor me.
Exactly.
I have 4 daughters. It's quite disruptive at home. I've got to tell you. But just as we wrap up now, and thank you so much, panel and everyone in the audience for being part of this. Just quickly, a call to action. Let's pick education. What should be the call to action on education for the Commonwealth?
I think gender diversity, not just in the workplace, but in STEM training, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics. It's a high priority for the UK government to see that globally shift to being more balanced.
Thank you very much. Ian.
Well, education across the generations, and particularly keeping the educators, the older educators, up to date.
And keep them in the market. Keep them teaching. Margaret.
Yeah, education is the best investment that you can give to anybody, from children to the old people. And so we really need to continue improving on how we put the systems in place, and really, I think Commonwealth would be a good platform to just strengthen that.
Thank you. Jenny.
A country and a Commonwealth's biggest resource, most important resource, is its people, and its people need to be educated. We should be valuing teachers appropriately. We don't at the moment.
John.
I think continuing to move away from the sort of fragmented, piecemeal type approach to the solutions and the system-based ones.
Employability and disrupting the way we look at career education and the progress to a career that we have within our schools.
Thank you.
And the provision of education as the tried and tested, most important entity in social mobility.
With that, I want to thank you all. Would you please thank the panel for what's been a great discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And please be in touch with us if you wish to have a chat about whatever you've heard during the course of today. Thank you so much.
And can we also thank you, Stefan, for a terrific conversation,
Thanks, Lou.
where communication has to be central to the success we're talking about. And not only the need and the value of communication, but as your panel showed, how it is delivered as well. And those of you who were here yesterday heard Anne Snowden from Canada talk about the pillars that are stopping often our progress, and not just in terms of private and public, male and female, young and old, traditional means of communication, and as we heard today, the new means of communication. But listening to your panel too, that the importance of education and the role of universities in breaking those pillars down too, just so central. Ladies and gentlemen, another big round of applause for our panel.
Thank you.